rushing to judgment. And I kept saying, but wait, let's think about this a minute, you know. I just think that we need to. It's sort of like, was it that play? Was it a Broadway play? Stop the World. I Want to Get Off. Sometimes I want to say, stop the television. We need to get off. If only for just a little while. Use it for the power that it has. But let's just think about how we're using it now and how it's affecting us as consumers. You know, because at home I'm a consumer, just as at work I'm a practitioner. But at home there are times when I just won't turn it on because I need to think, and I think that's the crusade I'm on right now. Not to turn off to use your medium and to insist that this medium be used for you, but in the best possible way to make you a better person and a better decision maker.
Charlene Hunter-Gault is national correspondent for the McNeil Lehrer NewsHour. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The C-SPAN school bus has won the cable television industry's highest honor, the Golden Cable Ace, and much of the credit goes to your local cable operator. In 1979, America's cable television industry created C-SPAN as a public service, and the industry's support continues. In 1993, the C-SPAN school bus began its travels. In its first year, 150 cable systems hosted the bus and crew. Thanks to your local cable company and others like it across the country, the bus has introduced more than 13,000 students, 3,100 teachers, and 125 elected officials to C-SPAN programming. The C-SPAN school bus and America's cable television companies, winners of the 1994 Golden Cable Ace. C-SPAN, a public service created by America's cable television companies.
Good evening from Washington, D.C. It's about 8 o'clock Eastern Time, and here's the C-SPAN program lineup. Next, a 3-hour profile of Congressman Newt Gingrich, the incoming House Speaker. We'll replay the program at around 11 p.m. After that, Hillary Rodham Clinton on the role of the First Lady. Then a discussion of the week's news with NBC's Tim Russert and ABC's Jeff Greenfield. Then a judicial year in review. And at 6 a.m. tomorrow, a simulcast of the New York City radio program, Imus in the Morning. And that's the C-SPAN program schedule. This is a special edition of Inside Congress. Over the next several hours, we'll air portions of interviews with friends, relatives, and colleagues of incoming House Speaker Newt Gingrich. They'll discuss his childhood and family, his teaching career, his political career, and what they expect of him as Speaker of the House. We'll talk with his mother, Kathleen Kit Gingrich, family friend Marian Alexander, debate coach Chester Gibson, and Gingrich biographer Melvin Steele. You'll also hear from former Gingrich Chief of Staff Frank Gregorski, political allies Jeff Eisenach and Grover Norquist, and close friends Heidi and Alvin Toffler. You'll also see C-SPAN interviews with Mr. Gingrich from 1984, 1986, and 1987, and portions of an interview with Mr. Gingrich taped Friday at one of his favorite places, Zoo Atlanta. We begin this special edition of Inside Congress with a look at incoming Speaker Newt Gingrich's early life. He was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania on June 17, 1943. His father and mother divorced soon after, and his mother married Bob Gingrich in 1946. Colonel Gingrich served in the U.S. Army, and the family traveled around the country and the world. One place the family lived for about 10 years was Hummelstown, Pennsylvania.
The house behind me is where Newt Gingrich lived during his early years.
I have to ask you, because in Washington, we always pronounce the last name Gingrich,
Yes.
and you've been saying Gingrich. What's the
Yes.
difference?
Well, it seems like when he was growing up here, his father's name was Gingrich, and of course his name was Gingrich. And it seems like when he went to the South, it became Gingrich.
How much time did you spend in this house with the Gingrich family?
Oh, quite a bit of time.
What was it like then?
Well, it was back in the 50s, and it was just that era, and so we lived, my wife and I lived about 4 blocks from here, and we walked here many evenings and played cards and just socialized with the Gingrichs.
Is
and
it
the children.
a second floor apartment, or
Yes,
how does this work?
It's a second floor apartment.
How
yes.
large inside?
Well, it had, I think it was 2 bedrooms and the kitchen and just a normal household.
How many children did the Gingrichs have when they lived here? Do you remember? Kind of early on in their marriage.
Yes, I think they had 2 daughters.
And Newt.
And Newt, yes, at the time, yes.
Any memories from the time, especially
sure.
of young Newt, that you'd like to tell us about?
Well, I can remember him playing in those steps there with these soldiers and giving them orders what they were supposed to do and what battle they were in and things like that, yes.
Tell me a little bit about your recollections of the family and of young Newt at the time.
Well, I can recall Newt when he was about 4 or 5 years old, when he lived on the square. We visited their home many times. My wife and I babysat him a few times when they went away, and he was just an average, nice young boy. He was very astute. He was interested in everything, and if it interested him, he liked it a lot, and if it didn't mean anything to him. But you didn't talk down to Nudie. We called him Nudie then. He had a very good vocabulary, and he spoke so much like an adult when he was little. But he was always interested in everything. He had a great fondness at that time growing up for animals and going to the zoo. I can recall that was a big thing with him. And playing with these soldiers out in the backyard and talking to them, and just a generally nice little boy.
I have read that there was a time when young Newt Gingrich got involved in a community issue.
Yes, yeah, that was when he was really interested in getting a zoo. He wanted to see a zoo built in this area, Hummelstown preferably, but if not, right in this area. He was into animals, and that was a big project of his when he was a little boy.
And so what did he do?
Well, there was one incident that he left the house one morning and got on the bus, which pulls right up alongside of his house, went to Harrisburg. I guess he was 12 years old, 10 or 11 years old at the time, and went in the city hall up there and asked to see the mayor, and the mayor saw him, and he walked in and had these plans all for this zoo and what it would take and the money it would cost, and he wanted the mayor of Harrisburg to help him get a zoo started.
What'd you think of that?
Well, we thought it was fantastic. I mean, the fact that we didn't know where he was, I think he told his mother he was going to the library, but it was getting late and he wasn't home, and we were getting concerned about him. And the bus pulled up that evening, he got off and came in the yard, and he said, you know, where have you been? He said, well, it's up at Harrisburg, you know. What's the problem? I'm here, you know, what's the fuss about?
Was he successful in his effort to get a zoo here?
No, he wasn't. I recall another incident. He went to the local undertaker here and asked if he could talk to him, and he went in, and of course the undertaker didn't know him at the time, and he was about 9 years old, and he wanted the undertaker to loan him $4,000 to start this zoo. And of course, back in the 50s, $4,000 was like $50,000 today. So the undertaker called one of his friends and said, who's this Nudie Gingrich that come in here, this kid comes in here with these plans, wants to start stew and wanted $4,000. And this friend of his lived below where Newt lives, and he told him who he was and what it was all about.
Why was the zoo so important?
I don't know, it was just one of his things. I know, talking to his 3rd grade teacher, she told me when he was going to school here that when Nudie was interested in something, a subject, he was the best in his class. And if he wasn't interested in it, it didn't matter. It's just like with the zoo. He was really interested in that and wanted to see it accomplished.
Nudie As a baby, the first time I heard Nudie, I didn't see him. I saw his shadow on the wall in the hospital. He was yelling his lungs out, and he just never stopped. He has talked always, always. That's why he's such a good speaker. My cousin kept the children, and Bob and Jenny, a friend, and I went to the shore overnight. When we got back, they had a zoo. They had anything that was wounded. They brought home, including a snake, which I'm terrified of. But I wish Marilyn were here to tell you about all the animals that Nudie, they just found them and they brought them home.
Besides animals, what else? And reading? What else was he
Reading.
interested in?
Fossils. And we were lucky enough in different posts to be able to go out in the hills, you know, and search for things. And he did. He had a box under his bed. You can ask him. He can tell you.
Did you think at one time he would end up having a career that would have something to do with animals or
Yeah.
fossils?
Yeah. Curator of a zoo. I thought that was where he was headed for. And as I said, now he has his zoo.
Speaker Gingrich, did you have something to do with?
Well, I helped the Zoo Atlanta get the 2 Komodo monitors or Komodo dragons from the National Zoo. The National Zoo has a breeding pair, and these were available. They're about twice the size. The other one's hidden right now, but they're about twice the size they were when we brought them down. I did 2 things. Through speech money, I helped pay a donation for conservation, which is what the National Zoo asked for. They're on permanent loan, I think. And secondly, they'll grow to be much, much bigger, about 10 feet long. The second thing was we had a local corporation, First Financial, loaned the plane, which came to Washington, a private corporate jet, came to Washington, and I went out to fly down with the 2 dragons. I thought this is going to be one of the really highlights of my career. And they were in the kind of bags you'd carry sneakers in. They were much younger than this, and what they had done is they had taken the dragon, which was about 18 inches long at that time, and put them in a cheesecloth bag, tied the bag shut, so they could breathe through this cheesecloth, but it was dark, so they thought it was asleep. They were trying to go to sleep. Dropped them in this one each in these 2 bags, zipped them up. I think they were Nike or Reebok bags. And I arrive, and the guy said, "Here, you carry yours." And I'm sitting there carrying a Komodo monitor or a Komodo dragon. And then we got them down here, and they took them out. They're very, very strong. And they're the only reptile that has slashing teeth. The way their teeth are designed, they're designed to bite chunks. All other reptiles have sort of needle teeth that bite and hold on. These actually slash, and the teeth have ridges in them where the food accumulates and bacteria develops. So when they slash like a young water buffalo or a deer, they're actually putting biological decay into their bloodstream. And the animal, one of the reasons the animal ultimately dies is that it actually gets blood poisoning. So it's an extraordinarily sophisticated system. And they're just different. I like the fact that nature is so dramatically more varied than we are.
You know that when you read the description up there that people watching will possibly make a correlation to your job and your, the young prey on insects and other small animals while adults consume deer, hogs, and carrion.
I think a lot of taxpayers sometimes think of the federal government as a giant Komodo dragon with the IRS coming around looking for opportunities to prey on the taxpayers. But
Your mother said in an interview we did last week with her that she always thought you were going to be a curator of a zoo. Why would she?
I really wanted to be. I love animals. I love dealing with animals. When I was young, I read all the books I could find on Raymond Ditmars at the New York Zoo, and Hornaday, who founded the New York Zoo, Hagenbeck, who built the great zoo in Hamburg. And I loved going to zoos. We lived in Harrisburg. My parents used to take me down to the Hershey Zoo and down to Philadelphia and down to the National Zoo. And I think, in a different life, I would probably be a zoo director. I mean, I think, or a zoo, or a curator, or somebody who went out and collected animals, or a biologist who went and lived in the jungle and studied them. I really am fascinated with nature. I used to teach environmental studies, and I love interacting with animals. I love the way in which you deal with how different they all are.
What's your favorite animal?
Oh, I don't know that I have a favorite. I mean,
Do you have any pets at home?
No, no. My wife said I can have any animal here I want. And she started us off actually by giving some tree boas over there, and then we gave the zoo 2 rhinoceroses, which are probably my favorite gift because they're so big. I mean, if you look at me, I'm not a tiny person, so maybe I feel some automatic. And one of them we got Terry Maple, who's a great director. I wanted to name it for Bo Calloway because Bo had done so much to help me over the years, and been Secretary of the Army, been very active in the Republican Party. And so Terry found the word Boma, which means fortress or castle in Swahili. And so one of the 2 rhinos is named Bo in honor of Bo Calloway, but they managed to, sort of be politically correct by having a Swahili name that happens to shorten into Bo.
Where did you get the rhinos?
Bo comes from Czechoslovakia, where they had a surplus, and Rosie, who's the female, comes from San Francisco, which has had a very successful series of breeding, a pair that has really been a very successful breeding pair. And so they've got a pair of black rhinos, which is they're really nice, and I love, I brought my relatives down. My nieces came down and got to feed Rosie when she was young. I mean, young for a rhino still means you're the size of a small cow. And my younger niece went home and talked about how she loved Rosie. That so as a little kid, even though this rhino is the size of small, she had somehow bonded in the process of giving pieces of carrots and pieces of apple to the rhino.
How do you find a couple of rhinoceroses to buy?
Well, the zoo does it. I mean, there's a worldwide breeding program, and Terry Maple is a very, he's a research psychiatrist.
Terry Maple runs this zoo?
Terry Maple is the director of the zoo here, and Terry is a world-renowned research psychologist focusing on primates, chimpanzees and gorillas, who was teaching at Georgia Tech, was a full professor. And Zoo Atlanta got in a lot of trouble, and they called him and asked him to come and take over the zoo, and he did, and he's been, I think, a brilliant director. He is part of the endangered species breeding programs. We now monitor by computer where every black rhinoceros is in zoos around the world, so you can tell what the genetic strains are, so you don't have too much inbreeding. And you do the same thing, Komodo dragons, pandas, which are very rare in captivity. But there are, Terry knows the exact number, there are many, many species now that are routinely monitored in zoos around the planet. And for example, they recently had drill baboons were bred here. And drills are very difficult to breed in captivity. And so that's quite a breakthrough. The gorilla collection here is world famous. And that's partly because Yerkes loaned us all their gorillas. I mean, so it's an amazing collection.
Now, you told us beforehand you were just about to wrap Newt's present.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us what you got him for Christmas?
Oh, sure. In fact, if anyone's available, they can go back. It's on my bed. It's an environmental sweatshirt, gray, and a nice size, in case it shrinks a little bit.
Now, why did you pick that out?
Oh, he's for the environment. His animals, my word, yes. Did you ever see the tie that he has? Is it a rhinoceros? A hippopotamus. Very proud of that tie.
I guess I'm an odd duck. My dad was a career soldier. He's now retired. And when I was a kid in high school, we lived in Orléans, France, on the French economy because he wasn't senior enough to get housing on base. And this was 1958, 100% inflation. The Fourth Republic was dying. They were fighting a war in Algeria. The French paratroopers literally came in and killed the government and brought de Gaulle back for a temporary dictatorship. In the middle of all that chaos, and I mean, as a kid, if you can imagine, leaving America, leaving television, leaving all the things we had, going to live in a country that still had World War II bomb damage, playing with French children whose fathers had been killed in the war, getting paid in scrip because they couldn't issue greenbacks because it would have destroyed the French economy, knowing that you could barter in a black market environment because the economy at 100% inflation, people do a lot of strange things. My dad took me to the battlefield of Verdun the spring of my freshman year in high school. And it was the largest battlefield of World War I. We stayed with a friend of his who'd been on the Bataan Death March in the Philippines and spent 3 years in a Japanese prison camp. And Verdun still had bomb damage or artillery damage from World War I, 42 years earlier. And the last day we went to the ossuary, which is a big building. The glassed-in basement has the bones of the 100,000 men who were killed, who they couldn't find. They pieced them, just literally rotting in the fields or blown apart by artillery. I guess out of that experience, I came to the conclusion after my freshman year in high school that all this is real. That when you step out there late at night and you look up at the U.S. Capitol and it's lit up and it's beautiful, this is the center of freedom on the planet. The capacity of our elected leadership to understand the challenges and to lead us and to guide us is the key test of a free society and whether or not we make it. We have at least an even money chance of not making it over the next 50 years, ceasing to be a free country, ceasing to be a society that we recognize. And so I decided in the summer of 1958 that I would do what I'm doing here today with you. And I have to tell you, it's a strange feeling. I'm a historian by training and taught history. This is a lot like history. I would say being a history teacher, reading biographies, reading historical novels was perfect preparation for my daily job. And it is extraordinarily demanding. It is very, very hard work. And yet it is the greatest feeling in the world to have had 500,000 people choose me to be their spokesman in the House and to be given the opportunity to learn and then to turn and to teach. So I, you know.
How long do you think you'll be challenged by that current job you've got? I mean,
I suspect until I get fired or quit and retire of old age. I mean, the challenge of how do you take the lessons of the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, the Declaration of Independence, all their writings, Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Franklin, how do you take that and reapply it for the 21st century in the age of television on a worldwide basis so that children in Indonesia and Nigeria and the United States grow up sharing freedom and loving the rule of law and believing in elections and seeking prosperity through enterprise. I have to tell you that that challenge is so enormously complex and so fascinating that my problem is I'm a little bit, you know, like the alcoholic in the winery. My job is to slow myself down and to discipline myself and to make sure that I stay fresh as a human being and don't just get burned out by inundation. But I can't imagine this job being boring.
Do you think all of this ability, this intellectual ability, was just a gift?
Yes, I think it was. I really do. I mean, not that he didn't apply himself. He certainly did that. But, you know, he was not an A student in school. Some people have the idea that because he's so bright, he had to be an A student. He wasn't. He could have been. But why apply himself? He got by the way he did. And he won a couple awards that last year. Benning Time was one. I forget what the other one was. We didn't even know he had applied for these things, you know, that's nudie. Came home, oh, look what I got because I did so-and-so. Oh. But he was a happy-go-lucky boy.
The Army experience, how much of an influence do you think that was on his life?
I think a lot because of the moving, for one thing.
Mm-hmm.
The different countries we lived in. And they all had libraries. So, you know, they said that when Nudie became a congressman, the big thrill was the Congressional Library, so he could read all those books.
You think he's working his way through them?
I wouldn't doubt it. I wouldn't doubt it. He reads, he went to that speed reading course. And if you ever watch him with a book, his finger goes zim, 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 zim. And he actually is absorbing all of this, not just reading it. Because you can ask him a year from now about such and such a book. He can tell you.
I read, I don't know, I probably average at least a book a week, I guess. I read on airplanes, I read, I adopted a habit when I was very young, which every class I talk to, of students, I tell, the number one thing people do other than sleep is wait. You know, they wait to go to the dentist, they wait at the store, they wait for their children. When they're children, they wait for their parents. If you can get in the habit of carrying a book, and you read 5 pages here and 9 pages there, over the course of a year, you can read 10 or 20 books just in the period other people waste. And so I read very intensely, and frankly, the greatest personal thrill out of being a congressman is that I have the Library of Congress. Dr. Borstein has presided over an extraordinary institution, and I get a great thrill out of being allowed to borrow books in the Library of Congress. And I'm probably, among congressmen at least, maybe one of the 2 or 3 most intense users of the library.
Newt Gingrich went to Emory University in Atlanta and graduated in 1965 with a degree in history. He then went to Tulane University, where he earned his PhD in history. While at Emory, he married his high school geometry teacher in 1962. They had 2 daughters, Linda Kathleen and Jacqueline Sue. They were divorced in 1981. He remarried that same year.
Newt's first marriage to Jackie is one that's been talked about quite a lot in the national press. Tell me what you want to be known about that story in his life, because we hear so much and such criticism of it.
That most of it isn't true. They don't know what she has done to him. When they got it is not true that she was in a hospital bed and he came in with a list of what he wanted out of the marriage. That is not true. And like he said to me one time, they never say anything about my taking the girls in to see their mother. That just isn't repeated, you know, that's on the good side for Gingrich. But when they finally settled their divorce, she got $15,000 a year. She got the home, she got 2 cars, and she got the money for both girls to go to any college they wanted to go to. And they went to very good, expensive private schools. And then when he made whip, she comes in again, she needs more money. Now she's a teacher, a math teacher, very good one. And I think that he finally settled for $500. I don't know if that was a month, I'm not sure on that. But also sign a paper that this would be the last demands that she could make on him.
Why do you think that you hear so much of the negative about that circumstance?
That's what people want to read. That's what they enjoy, you know.
Is that a marriage that you thought wouldn't last when he made it?
When he made it.
He was pretty young when he got married.
19. I don't know. I look for the good things. You know, I don't think that maybe they won't. And then they had Kathy, and she was that little doll. And 2 years later, they had Jackie Sue. And they never had it easy, then money-wise. Nudie at Emory managed apartments. He had a newspaper route, which I went on in one Easter.
Newt Gingrich spent the years 1970 to 1978 teaching at West Georgia College.
I don't remember the precise date, but it was in September of 1970, and Newt was a brand new professor at West Georgia College. He had just moved his family here, and they lived right across the street from the campus, literally across the street. And I think they had begun unpacking, and he decided that Saturday morning to walk over and look at the campus. He'd never seen it before because he had applied for the job while he was in Belgium, finishing up a doctoral dissertation, and had been hired sight unseen just based on the stuff he'd sent us. Yeah, at first it was just another professor. He had piqued my interest considerably when he applied. I was on the committee that was deciding who we hire and that sort of thing. And our chairman at the time, Dr. Ben Kennedy, and I talked about Newt. One of the things he included in his application was a long reading list. So you'll know more about me. These are the books I've read in the past year. And it was a full page of the most eclectic list of books I'd ever seen. He had stuff on business management, on zoology, on history, on government, international politics, some novels. I think there was something on yoga or something in it. It's just a wide range of things. His credentials were flawless. He'd graduated from Emory University with his undergraduate degree, and then Tulane with his master's and doctorate, and had very good recommendations. And so we felt we wanted to try this guy out. He really looks interesting. And one of the few people that we saw at the time that had actually put together a full page on why he wanted to teach and what he wanted to do. When I'm in the classroom, I want to do these things. This is what's important to me as a teacher, etc. And it was a fascinating package that he had sent. So when he said, "I'm Newt Gingrich," I said, "Oh yeah, you're the guy that sent us the book list," and we began talking about that. And once he gets talking, he just keeps talking, and so we spent a good part of the morning visiting and talking.
Now, how did the relationship between Mr. Gingrich and yourself progress from there over the next couple of years?
I became one of Newt's friends. People that knew Newt at that time liked him a lot. He was an extremely likable guy. And he and I became very good friends during that period.
Professionally and socially?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Take us into that.
Well, we were, I guess at that time, probably 18 to 21 faculty members in history. And we were fairly close. We spent a lot of time together socially, away from campus. On campus, he and I literally taught, a team taught classes together. We taught a course on 20th century world history called The 20th Century World. And Newt handled the American history part of it, and I did the European part. And a professor who was his office mate at the time, named Floyd Hoskins, Dr. Hoskins, he took the Asian part of it. And so we got to know each other pretty well, teaching together in the same classroom with the same students, and did a lot of experimenting. And I remember at one point we didn't tell Hoskins, but Gingrich and I fought World War II backwards. And not exactly backwards. We had, everywhere America won, we lost, and everywhere we lost, we won. And so we ended up with the Russians and Germans joining together and conquering the United States and all this. And we were trying to find out what effect this will have on the students. And most of them sat there and just took notes faithfully, went right along. And a few of them raised questions. And when we had the United States losing the Battle of Guadalcanal, Hoskins had to stand up at that point. He said, "That's not true." You know, I was there, and he was. He won a Silver Star for his performance at Guadalcanal in the Navy. And we said, "Well, Floyd, your ship was sunk, and you were in the water. You didn't know what was going on." And he said, "Well, yeah." I said, "Okay, sit down." And so we had a good time talking with students and being provocative. And Newt was more provocative than either of us were. But we established a good working relationship and professional relationship. And all of us had the view of trying to inspire students and trying to make them think. That was our main objective. Not so much learn facts, but learn to think critically and to take the facts and develop something from it. Socially, we did not go to the same church, but we had basically the same ideas, I think, about religion. We would be involved politically. I kept trying to get Newt to be a Democrat, and he wasn't real interested in doing that. He was very active and worked with the Republican Party, primarily in Atlanta, in the state party. And so I wasn't involved in much of his early 70, 71, 72 period. He was separate from us because I was involved at that time with Democrats. And
was he involved politically at all?
Yeah, very much involved, but not running for anything. He was involved helping other people do things.
From the moment he stepped on campus?
Oh yeah, he was from 1960 on. He was involved politically. He worked in Nixon's race when he was in high school in Muskogee County, which is Columbus, Georgia, which is Fort Benning, where his daddy was stationed.
Getting back to the students just for a minute, did they like him as a professor?
Yeah, they sure did. I'm doing a biography of Gingrich now, and in the process I've interviewed a lot of the students and professors, and they thought very highly of him. They sure did.
What are you hearing as you're preparing for the book? What sort of things have stuck with people over the years?
How provocative he was, how much he tried to inspire students to think, how he would not tell them what to do so much as force them to look at things differently. I remember one time he came in and made a statement. He was forever making bold statements that the students would have to respond to. And this particular one he talked about, in the next century, which wasn't that far away at the time, Brazil will dominate the Western Hemisphere. You know, what do you think about that? And then they, you know, what are you talking about? And then some students would say, well, that's possible, and explain why. And then other students would say, no, that can't happen, and this is why. And a lot of times Newt didn't really care one way or the other. The statements he would think up were simply provocative things to make people think and walk through stuff. And it had that effect, and they really liked him. frequently he would have students following him home. He'd finish an environmental studies class, for instance, and they would wander over to his house with him because it was so close to campus and sit around and drink coffee or Cokes or whatever and continue talking.
Have you spoken to any of those students since Election Day of this year?
Yeah.
Are any of them surprised that he wound up as Speaker of the House?
Yeah. Yeah, they are. They never really thought about it. Most of those students were not deeply involved in the political side of Newt. Some of them were. Some of them actually went on and were so impressed with the man that they became workers in his campaigns. One of them was his driver for 2 campaigns, 76 and 78, and then worked for him briefly for about a year when he became a congressman. So they were a pretty committed bunch. But a lot of them were surprised, yeah. And a lot of the people that knew Newt, for instance, one of the things that happened on his street is they did block parties, and Newt enjoyed the block parties. He also enjoyed having the close friends of his come over in the evening for all-night pig roast. He would dig up his driveway, which was dirt and gravel, and dig a pit, and would cook a pig all night and have barbecue the next day. And a group of us would sit around and drink a beer or two or whatever and talk and philosophize and lie to each other and do all of that sort of thing all evening. And those were very interesting evenings. And it was a real eclectic group of people. You had people in humanistic psychology would sit in, and others would be very conservative types, and others would be very moderate. It didn't really matter your politics so much as it did whether you were an interesting person. And you'd like to get ideas and understand how people thought and what made them tick, that sort of thing.
You mentioned that you shared common religious values, but you didn't go to the same church, I believe.
No, I had been a Baptist, and by the time Newt came, was a member of the Methodist Church. And
you were a member?
I was a member of the Methodist Church. I grew up as a Baptist, but I had joined the Methodist Church when I returned. I'd been in Carrollton for a few years, and then I went off to Germany to do work on my doctoral dissertation and came back. And then I joined the Methodist Church when I returned. And when Newt came, he joined the First Baptist Church and was a deacon, became a deacon very quickly in that church when he was here.
I really feel, Brian, incredibly rich. There's a scene you may remember in Lawrence of Arabia where Anthony Quinn is playing an Arab says to Lawrence that he has given away all of his money to his people, but he is rich beyond belief because of his family, meaning his whole tribe. And I look back over my life, my mom and dad, a time when my dad was on a first lieutenant's salary and clearly couldn't afford it. He bought the Encyclopedia Americana, which was very expensive back in the mid-50s, because he wanted me to have access to knowledge. I think of all the times my mother put up with me and kept encouraging me to do things that were clearly nutty, but that were training for me to go on and learn the business I'm in. A man who's now deceased named Paul Walker, who ran a classic small-town weekly giveaway newspaper in Harrisburg called the Home Star. And I walked in, at the age of 10, I was sent over to see him because I wanted a zoo for Harrisburg. And he said to me, you write the article and I'll print it. He said, there's a typewriter. It was an old-time, pound-away kind of typewriter. And I said, I can't type. He said, you can now. And he said, so I sat down and I wrote an open letter to the people of Harrisburg, which he put on page 1 of that local paper, and it was about why we needed a zoo in Harrisburg. And you know, you do things like that. And you have a guy like that who was then in his 50s who encouraged me. And over the years, he gave me a clipping one time of a little article about Abraham Lincoln having lost 5 times. And I lost twice before I finally won. And many was the time when I was out there shaking hands after those 2 defeats, when I think of that clipping that Paul Walker gave me on persistence. And I think my attitude towards the news media, the reason that I'm so accessible and that I try to always be available, goes back to the training that Paul gave me all the way up through high school. And when we were in Europe, I'd write letters home and he'd write back. Nando Amabile, a man who lives here in Washington now, was my sophomore English teacher after I had decided that I really did want to be involved in this process of preserving and extending freedom. And I went to him and said, I want to write a paper on the balance of world power. And that's all I want to do for my sophomore English class in high school. And he said, fine. So I wrote what was about a 200-page paper as a sophomore. And he said, I'll read it once. And he was here, and he wrote me after I finally won, and he said he thought I really vindicated his willingness to risk on kids, that I'd done things he'd hoped I'd do. So I look back over all these people, Dr. Yielding at Baker High, who taught government and who believed in the courage of your conviction and that that's what America was.
Newt Gingrich first ran for a seat in the House of Representatives in 1974. He lost that race and lost again in 1976. However, in 1978, he won the 6th District congressional seat from Georgia. Gaining seniority, Mr. Gingrich became the minority whip in the House in 1989, and now has been elected Speaker of the House by the new Republican majority.
Let's talk about 1974. He had been here for 4 years, or almost 4 years, I guess, and he decided to run for Congress the first time, correct?
Well, he decided in 73, but 74 was the first race. That's right.
Tell us, any conversations with you on whether he should do that or not?
Yeah, we talked about it quite a bit. He, I guess, really began talking first with the people in the party rather than with college folks. He was more concerned to get a strong base and to be sure that they thought it was the right thing to do and that they would support him. And so he had begun talking to county and district chairmen and people he met who had been active in the Republican Party and had kind of a group together that felt it was a good thing for him to do. And a lot of people had approached him and suggested he ought to run for something, but most of them thought he ought to run for state senate or state representative. And he and I talked about it off and on. He felt like he could actually win a race. I told him I didn't think he could. And I was trying to convince him that he should run as a Democrat and maybe go for state senate or something of that sort and win one of those races, get to be a little high profile, and then go for Congress. And he wasn't real sure that that's what he wanted to do. And I remember one morning he came early. My wife brought us some pancakes and coffee down. We sat in my den, and this was in 73, and he laid out why he thought he could win. And he had the numbers and the county votes and totals and had looked at it very carefully. And he convinced me that morning, did away with my skepticism, that it was possible. And so we spent a good long morning talking about it and debating it, and me trying, in a sense, to talk him out of it. And by the time we got through talking, he had talked me into supporting him, and so I did. I was very active in his campaign.
Did anybody here on the campus, it being an academic atmosphere, have problems with the fact that he was launching a political career from his academic base, for lack of a better term?
I don't remember any particular problems. He received the support of the president of the college, the dean. All of these people gave him permission to take unpaid leave of absence and that sort of thing. I think there might have been some individuals on campus who felt like it was not a good thing to do, that he couldn't possibly be a good teacher if he was doing this. He needed to focus strictly on teaching and nothing else, that sort of thing. But that's a guess on my part. I don't remember any particular person.
Did you have an official role in that campaign?
Yeah. I was a volunteer coordinator. I worked to get Democrats to support Newt, and was on his, in fact, I was chairman of the advisory committee, which was a small group of people that advised him on what he should be doing the next week and what kind of strategy to take and that sort of thing.
He lost that race.
He'd lost it. He got 48.5% of the vote, lost by 2,774 votes. Came very close to winning.
Lost the race and came back here and continued teaching?
Mm-hmm.
Walk us through, very briefly, the next cycle, 1976.
He was determined when he lost the first race, and having come so close, that he definitely was going to run again. A lot of people asked him to do that, wanted him to do it. They felt it was a good thing. I think he probably would have, whether anybody had asked him to or not, because he had wanted to be in Congress since he was a teenager. And he worked, I would guess, almost constantly from well, let's see, I guess he took a little time off in November, right after the defeat, and picked up again around the first of the year. But at that point, he had a driver who would pick him up a volunteer driver. And after he would get through with his classes and do whatever committee work he had to do, if he had 5 or 6 hours free in the afternoon or evening, he would be out campaigning. And that's in '73. He continued that campaign nonstop. And in a sense, since his defeat, excuse me, not '73, it'd be '75. He had the election in '74, lost it. '75, all during that year, he continued working. And in a sense, has never stopped. It was during that first campaign that they came up with the support group for his campaign called Friends of Newt Gingrich. And the reason they called it that is because it literally is what it was. The very first people that supported him were personal friends. And when we tried to get money, those were the people that went to the bank with him and said, okay, we're going to borrow $2,000 and each of us will sign on for $100, this sort of thing. You get 20 guys that'll agree, we'll pay $100 or we'll pay $500 or whatever. And we used that technique frequently in his first 2 campaigns to get support.
And he lost again in '76? How close was that race?
That was a very close race. He lost, it was about, he might have gotten 49% in that one. It was very close, though.
And decided again to go continue campaigning for '78?
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a little difference. See that you had mitigating circumstances here. In '74, right before the election, Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. And that really turned a lot of people off. And he thought, you know, if Ford hadn't done that, I might have made it. Then in '76, when he was running, Jimmy Carter was running for president. In Georgia, that meant a lot of people voted straight Democrat because they wanted to help Jimmy. And so Newt was running against that. And he figured, okay, the third time, hopefully none of this is going to be happening to me, and I can have a straight shot at it. Well, as it turned out, the man he had been running against, Congressman Flint, John Flint, retired. He decided not to run in '78. And so it was an open shot at it. And the person who won the Democratic nomination was a state senator from Griffin, Georgia, by the name of Virginia Shepard. And so Newt was able to run against her and not against Flint at that time. He also had been encouraged, incidentally, by Guy Vanderjack to work in the, or to run in the '78 race. Vanderjack wanted him to run. He was head of the, the RNCC, I guess, at the time, and believed that Newt could win it and began to try to help a little more than they had in the past in finances and sending down professionals, people like this, to help out.
So he lost twice and won in 1978?
He won in 1978.
And has been reelected every time?
Has been reelected ever since.
Minor story you'll appreciate. In 1960, I knew a lot. I'd read a lot of books, and I was very aggressive and, you know, all that, and very brash. Prince came and said, I like you, what you're doing. I'd like you to run my campaign. I'm going to run for Congress. He was a very attractive, dynamic vice president of a chicken company in Gainesville, Georgia. And it tells a lot about my luck that he and I happened to be in the only district Barry Goldwater didn't carry. And so I went up there to work for him, and he began to figure out that I knew a lot about politics from books, but I didn't know a lot about life yet. I was a pretty young kid, and I was 20 years old at the time. And we came to Washington for the first big visit to convince the various interest groups in Washington to back Jack Prince for Congress. And when he found himself showing me how to tie a tie, because I'd always used a clip-on to that point, I think it sort of began to dawn on him we had a long way to go. But Jack Prince, I was with Jack 2 weeks ago in Gainesville, and he's another one of those people who really educated me and taught me a lot, and then we had worked out as part of the agreement that he would co-sign notes for me to go back to school and finish my college. And I will always, I guess the rest of my life, owe a great deal to Jack Prince.
We are in room 303 of the Humanities Building on the campus of West Georgia College in Carrollton, Georgia, the place where we spent many hours working with Newt Gingrich, training him in the art of debate. Newt came here in the early 70s and was on the faculty in history, developed an environmental studies program, ran some unsuccessful campaigns against Jack Flint, and then finally won. And once he won, we became very closely associated with him in terms of not only just myself, but the members of the debating team. Former West Georgia debater ran his 1992 campaign.
You both came here at the same time?
Yes, we joined the faculty at the same time.
What did you think of him when you first met him?
Newt struck me as an incredibly bright, good listener, well-read, a little hot under the collar at times. In fact, through the years, one of our biggest problems has been to keep him logical in debate and not get too emotional. But that's difficult. But we did that specifically by training him in this very room. He would stand at that podium. Newt would sit at this table here, and we would fill the room with a hostile audience. For example, let me show you a clip of a debate where we were preparing him to debate at the Oxford Union against the Vice President of Nicaragua. Newt had never participated in an Oxford-style debate where they heckle you from the audience. And so he said, Chester, I'd like to have that experience. So I'll show you a tape here of where we got Newt in this room, and we would go through the process of I would actually debate him, and then he would stand up, make his arguments, and then the folks in the audience would ask questions. In fact, right in the middle of his speech, they would interrupt him and ask questions. And after he came back from the Oxford Union, he was very pleased with his performance. You may notice in this training that Newt relies on 3x5 index cards. He spends some time, maybe 5 minutes before a major speech, writing the speech. He speaks extemporaneously very effectively because he has a great memory. But sometimes he gets himself in trouble when he speaks off the cuff without thinking. He himself has admitted that some of his language that he's used has not been very effective, and we had to work on that. I think one of the things we did that was very successful with Newt was keeping him focused on facts and information in the debate rather than the emotional side of it.
What year is this?
This is in the mid-'80s, about 1984, 1985, when he was preparing for this debate, and it focused on our relationships in Central America. And when Newt actually got to the debate, we don't have time to show you the video of it, but I keep videos of all of Newt's debates. I have a video of that debate, and the audience loved him. He discarded his notes, he discarded his manuscript, and he just spoke, and they stood and cheered at the Oxford Union, and he even got a lot of votes, even though he was detested there by a lot of people.
Did you go over there with him?
No, but he came back. When he came back, we immediately called a crowd together in Carrollton and showed the tape of the debate, and they loved it. He is a skilled communicator. I also worked with him in terms of debating against his political opponents. We have worked on how you would phrase certain arguments. One thing, for example, that Newt likes to do is he likes to turn an opponent's argument on them. David Worley in a debate, for example, we have a tape of that. David Worley would say, well, now I'm basically a conservative. And Newt would turn to him and say, well, did you vote for Michael Dukakis? And Worley would refuse to answer the question. And Newt would simply say, it's a simple question. Did you vote for Michael Dukakis? That will tell us whether you're a conservative or not. And Worley was trying to appeal to all the conservative voters in this district, but when he would not reveal whether or not he voted for Mondale or Dukakis, Newt felt that he had him pinned as a liberal, and that was a strategy of Newt's.
Most people know or have heard probably that he is formerly was a history professor. What kind of student was he? Is he a good student?
He is a great listener. After these debates would end, for example, he would sit at that table and let us just blast him. For example, he rambles all the time. Sometimes you'll ask him a question and he'll go all over the world, and it's a great answer that he's giving, but he takes too long. And so we would say, Newt, why don't you, instead of saying that in 6 minutes, why don't you say it in 1? And he would not get defensive. I have never seen him defensive when being criticized in a debate situation. But he will get defensive when someone in a debate tries to personalize the attacks on him. And that's kind of interesting because Newt tends to use that strategy himself. But it's still, he is able, I think, through being a good listener and being a good reader, to be a great debater.
What other tapes do you have? You mentioned a campaign of his.
Oh, yes. I think that one of my favorite times was when the West Georgia College debating team sponsored a debate here on campus against David Worley. And in this particular debate, David Worley was making a comment about Newt going on a jaunt to Iraq during the time that the war was going on. And Newt got very upset at the fact that Worley would call his trip over there a jaunt. So here we are. This is a West Georgia College debater that's on the panel asking David Worley what he thought about Newt's trip overseas. And Worley said, I think it's just a junket he's going on. And Newt, we knew that was coming, so we said, Newt, don't get angry when Worley accuses you of going on a junket. And don't even look at Worley. We would coach him not to look at Worley because that tended to get Newt even more upset when Worley would do that kind of thing. So you'll notice when the camera pans over to Newt, you'll see him looking straight ahead at the audience and not looking at his opponent. I think they were kind of so hostile toward each other they didn't even shake hands before the debate. And that is not unusual. Newt wants to let people know that if they're going to say despicable things that are not true, he's not going to associate with them. So this was a situation in which we would train Newt after the debate. We would bring the videotape up here. We'd take a look at the debate and tell Newt what he did right and wrong.
Do you keep in touch with him these days and call him up and tell him, I saw you on, whatever the morning show is? And
through Mel Steele, Newt and I stay in communication. A lot of it is written communication. He writes me letters saying, this is what I need to know. For example, when he was putting the course together at Kennesaw, he wrote a letter and asked me to do that. So yes, we write constantly. So there have been times when he's just sit down when he's at the table with the president and writing a personal note to him. And Newt does a lot of that. Someone told me that he was still writing the contract for America on the steps of the Capitol right before the speech. I don't know if that's true or not, but that sounds just like Newt because he prepares a lot, but sometimes that preparation is in a small period of time.
Let's watch a little of this debate with Newt Gingrich. What year was this again?
This is a debate in 1990 against Worley, and we'll be glad to let you hear some of the comments that Newt is making. This is particularly a comment, I think, about Iraq.
Very, very good question. I should say that the other night when I had a chance to talk by telephone with the Desert Shield families here in Carrollton, and Catherine Brock was there representing me, it was really a powerful reminder of the human side of the buildup. As you know, I spent several days over there at the request of Secretary of Defense Cheney as part of the leadership delegation. And it was very sobering. We met with Marines, Air Force, Navy, and Army forces, also met with the Saudi Arabians, the Kuwaitis, and the Egyptians. Had about 2 hours with the King of Saudi Arabia and about an hour and a half with the President of Mubarak of Egypt. I believe, based on everything I've seen in the briefings I've had, that we had no choice. That Saddam Hussein is an extraordinarily dangerous man, that all of our intelligence operations indicated he was about to invade Saudi Arabia, that if he retains 20% of the world's oil supply, which is what he'll have with Kuwait, that
there's no question that his skills have increased. He has learned, for example, not to be so defensive. There was one debate against Joe Kennedy on the Larry King show in which Joe Kennedy just ate Newt alive. And it's because he was able to get Newt on the defensive about George Bush. And immediately after I heard that debate, I wrote Newt a scathing 2-page letter in which I said, you should never lose a debate to Joe Kennedy, but you just lost it because you didn't stay on the offensive and you let him get on the defensive. Same thing happens here. You'll notice, for example, he is not looking at David Worley. Throughout this 1 hour and a half debate, he refused to look at David Worley. He would look at the audience, he would get the crowd going, get them stirred up, and Newt really does well when he gets the audience with him.
How recently have you given him any advice on debating or public speaking?
I sent a letter to him after some of these comments came out with regards to his vitriolic use of language and hate speech and that kind of thing. I do think that Newt chooses words inappropriately at times, and within the last 6 months I sent him a letter to that effect. One time he asked me, he said, Chester, what do I need to do to project the image of a statesman? And I said, Newt, one of the things that you need to do is to be more thoughtful about the language that you're going to use before you use it. You don't always have to use a scathing attack. Be more of a teacher. And he appreciated that comment because Newt is great when he is at a teaching role. But he's also great when someone wants to sting him with something, if they accuse him, for example, on the orphanage, the use of the orphanage. His retort to that was, would you prefer to see them in a dumpster? And just the visual image of that conjures up some feeling on behalf, well, maybe orphanages aren't bad when you compare it to the alternative. But when he makes statements like, he made one, my purpose is to move the planet. It may well be that that's an objective, but it comes across sometimes as arrogant. I think he's also improved in terms of his appearance. When he's on television, for example, you'll notice that his head always tilts to the right. I've given him that criticism several times. Now, that may be subconscious, tilt to the right. But he does not always have a good appearance on television when he moves his hands in front of his face. But he's learned some things like that, and he's very receptive to those types of criticisms.
What does he need to work on, do you think, as a coach, as a debating teacher?
First of all, he needs to take a little bit more time before he's going to make a formal presentation. Newt is always in such a hurry. He's a hard worker, works 16, 18 hours a day, but he needs to take a few more minutes of preparation time before a major speech. He shouldn't write it out in a manuscript. In fact, I coached him when he was preparing for the course in Kennesaw, had a letter from him in which he said that the suggestion about speaking from an outline for him was a lot better than speaking from a manuscript. John Kennedy could use a manuscript. Newt Gingrich is a disaster with a manuscript. But he needs more preparation time before the speech. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the human side of Newt Gingrich has not really come out before the public. He has a deep sense of humanity about him that does not come across in his communication. And I really believe, I would like for the American public to see that side of him, because he is characterized as a vicious, mean-spirited, tough-talking individual. But there's also a compassionate side to Newt Gingrich, because he really believes that the system has to change for America to be better. And I'd like for him to show more of that side.
How do you go about doing that if that is, and you think that's more of a natural way that he is? Why do you have to tell somebody to do something to look more natural? You know what I'm asking?
Well, because in the age of television, where the image that is projected there has such an impact upon public opinion, I think you have to pay attention to those kinds of things. I think you have to pay attention to the kind of language that you use, because those sound bites, for example, Sam Donaldson can bait Newt Gingrich. Sam will ask a question by saying, "Isn't it a dumb thing?" And then Newt will pick up on dumb thing and start making outrageous statements incorporating Sam's term. I don't think that's a good idea, because sometimes those newsmen are baiting you.
You seem to have some fairly serious conversations with him. How does he respond when you tell him, you know, he didn't come off well or he lost that debate?
In 24 years, never a single defensive response, because he knows, since I'm not one of his paid consultants, I have no axe to grind or anything. I'm just telling him what I think about his performance. And it really, to have me say that he lost to Joe Kennedy was not an easy thing for his Newt's ego. But Joe Kennedy just was able to beat him in that debate situation because he was on the defensive. Newt is, as he was in the training in this room, he would welcome the most vocal opponent to blast him in any way they could, and he maintains control in spite of that criticism. And I think that's the mark of a person who wants to be better and to communicate better what his ideas are. Newt does not always communicate what's in his mind. His words sometimes get in the way, and he's sometimes too verbose.
We haven't talked at all about politics. Do you share his political worldview?
Yes, in fact, he has sent to me other political candidates. Paul Coverdale has been in this room when he was debating against Weiss Fowler. Mac Mattingly sat in this room. I have a conservative political philosophy. I don't agree with all of the positions that he takes, but and that's a rare breed on the college campus. Most are. You'll find a lot of the professors here would not share my views on Newt Gingrich, but I share the view that our society has got to have less government to be more effective.
What are some of the lunchroom conversations these days when the name Newt Gingrich comes up here on the campus?
Newt Gingrich on this campus is probably not in great favor with a lot of the professors, especially in some of the departments that he worked with very closely. I know some of them feel very strongly that he is an unethical person, power-hungry, interested in nothing but his own personal advancement. And so you'll find a good bit of criticism, although I will say that Newt, we have a new president at West Georgia College, and I think they have communicated some. Newt gave money to our Alumni Association, and so he has been a supporter of West Georgia College and has a small core of supporters here, but I wouldn't say that it's widespread.
In April 1978, I was a 23-year-old student resuming his education at West Georgia College, and Newt was in his last quarter as a teacher, in this case in the biology building. I had made a comment to a teacher in that building that in a class that I had that I was interested in politics, and this lady said, I can't remember her name, but she said, you know, we have this guy down the hall that has actually run for Congress twice and lost. But he's running again this year, and he may need a volunteer, he may need a driver, he may need you to do something for him. So after about a week of deciding, I checked in the almanac to make sure this guy really was somebody who'd run for Congress, and I thought, wow, there he is. You know, he's right down the hall in our building. I went to see him, talked a little bit about tax cuts. He gave me a book to read. He said, okay, you can be an assistant driver. You can drive me on Saturdays. A guy named Arthur Fessenden needs time off now and then, so you can drive me on Saturdays. So I started doing that every second or third Saturday, and then eventually became a campaign research director in '78.
When you were in the car driving with him, what did you talk about?
Oh, it was early Newt. I mean, it was what do we do about South Africa? What do we do about the minimum wage? What would you do about capital formation? It was almost like a master's orals. And which was great, because I had always wanted to find somebody important to talk about these things to. And I had some ideas, and he listened, and he gave me things to think about. One of the interesting things from '78 was that he got me to go to a professor that he knew and that I knew and arrange an independent study course designed around the Kennedy tax cuts. Now, the Kemp-Roth tax cut of '78 was based on the Kennedy tax cut of '62 to '64. And so Newt said, why don't you go get credit for studying this Kennedy's tax cut and how it turned out and how he passed it. Write that paper. You can get credit for it. Give the paper to me. I need to know, and here are some of the questions that you can answer. So this guy was an innovator, sort of a all equals all guy from day one. He would figure out a way, which is the secret of political leadership, to meet different people's objective and also help him, you know, along the way.
Do you remember how you did in the paper?
Oh, I got an A+. It was a great paper.
What is the Conservative Opportunity Society?
The Conservative Opportunity Society is a name and a theme that was hatched, discovered, put together, I'm not sure what the verb was, in the spring of '82. I was Newt's chief of staff at the time. Newt was looking for a formulation that would contrast with a formulation to characterize liberals and Democrats. So working with Bob Teeter and Dick Worthlam, he tested a number of formulations, and I remember the day he came back into the office so excited because he found one for our side that would swamp the other side. At the time, it was Conservative Opportunity State. We didn't have society at that point, versus Liberal Welfare State. A poll had been run on this by the NRCC, and the results were, it was a generic congressional test. Would you vote for a candidate if you knew nothing about him except that he were a favored a conservative opportunity state against a candidate for Congress who, if you knew nothing about him, favored a liberal welfare state? The result was 74 to 17 for COS. And Newt came back and he said, that's it. This is what we're going to use to unify the theme this year. I'm going to get as many of my colleagues as I can to start talking about this. It took about a year. Vin Weber used it in '82, but by '83, we'd lost the number of seats in the House. 26 seats were lost in '82 because of the recession. Newt formed 3 groups, and they were all COS groups. One was a Wednesday noon group, which was conservative activists, Paul Weyrich, Richard Rahn, etc., Bert Pines. Another one was a leadership group with Trent Lott, and the other one was like-minded colleagues, Newt's age, Newt's temperament, that would work and do COS-type projects.
How does this mind work?
Wow. I recently published an article in Roll Call that said you can't understand Newt by going through history text, economic text, liberal, conservative. You have to do it by looking at Jungian psychology. Newt is an extroverted intuitor. He has intuitions galore. They come to him. He can't explain them. He can act on them and then later explain sort of what he's doing if you, as he says, if you stop me and force me to tell you what I'm doing, I'll tell you. Things come to him so fast, and they change from time to time, that nobody in the early days could keep up with him. He needed a larger and larger galaxy of people and organizations and allies to simply try all of the projects and experiments that he would come up with. But in the early days, we were routinely overwhelmed by it. He was the most creative person in the room, he was the most energetic person in the room, and he was not satisfied with what most of us did because he had already moved on at that point by the time we were able to do something.
How long did you work for him?
5 years overall.
Doing what? In addition to the campaign, you moved to the congressional staff?
Yes, I did. I was an LBJ intern. I was a national affairs projects person in 1980, and then I was chief of staff for exactly 21 months, actually. I did some minority enterprise work, and I also, of course, in the early year, did research for the campaign. So I had different vantage points, but I was usually in the line of fire in terms of what Newt was most enthusiastic about, which was this national Republican majority, building a progressive Republican Party and making it become the majority. And the test was always, will we get a majority in the House? He never wavered from that, and all of the experiments, at least on the national side, were aimed at putting together the coalition, the ideas, the vehicles, the innovations that would bring that about.
The New Conservatives, back to this article in the Dallas Times-Herald, it points out that your fight is not for the presidential nomination, but rather for the House of Representatives, for the congressional wing of the party and the things that Republicans will stand for in the years to come. Is that the truth? Does it not matter so much who is president?
Well, I think it matters some who's president. I think it's good for the country that Ronald Reagan, who is the most effective president since Franklin Roosevelt. But I would just say that I think it is very, very important that we get back to the habit that was built into the Founding Fathers' Constitution, that what the party believes in, where we go over 10, 20, 30 years, is also terribly important. And I think, unfortunately, for the last half century, starting with Franklin Roosevelt, we focus too much on one person. People keep coming up to me on the floor, reporters, and saying, what do you think about 88? And I keep telling them, I don't care about 88. I care about 84. I care about what we do in 85. Now, after that, I'll talk about 86. But we need to learn to build a party movement, not just a one-man or a one-person movement.
Newt is an amazing combination of a practical, applied politician with all of the skills and the joy of battle that comes with the practical world of politics, and at the same time is an intellect of really amazing capabilities. I met Newt, actually was doing some work at the Heritage Foundation on drug abuse, doing some policy work there. And he was interested in that topic, and a friend of mine said, you ought to meet this guy Eisenach. So we got together. What we found out, I think, the first time we met, he and I came to Washington at the same time in 1978, and for 10 years on parallel and completely unconnected tracks, we'd been thinking many of the same thoughts. He had, frankly, more profound and thoughtful level than I had, but the question we had both been asking and trying to answer is, what would conservative governance look like as opposed to conservative opposition to liberal governance? And it's a question that still remains to be kind of finally answered, but both of us had spent a lot of time thinking that through. I had worked on Pete DuPont's presidential campaign as director of research and issues for that campaign, and we got some ideas out there in terms of welfare and education choice and Social Security, and I think Newt was attracted to some of the things that Pete had been talking about.
Is he an easy person? If one were to sit down with Newt Gingrich for the first time, is he easy to get to know? Is he easy to understand?
He is a very easy person and a very hard person simultaneously. He's very easy in the sense he's very easygoing. He's very open and personable. He's very informal. And there's no kind of false sense of importance about him. There's no shell there. He's all there right in front of you. But that's also what's hard, because he is very, very quick. And he asks very, very hard questions, and good questions. So when you sit down in the meeting with Newt Gingrich, if you're going to lay out what you thought was 2 hours worth of ideas, and in the first 5 minutes he's likely to absorb everything that you thought you had to tell him and ask you 10 questions you hadn't thought of, and that can be kind of scary. And it's all in the most kind of pleasant kind of way. But intellectually, boy, it is challenging.
What is the Progress and Freedom Foundation?
Progress and Freedom Foundation is a think tank here in Washington. Jay Keyworth and I created it in 1993. Jay was President Reagan's science advisor. Really based on the notion that America is leaving the industrial age, as Alvin and Heidi Toffler talk about the second wave versus the third wave, and entering an information age, and that there are big social consequences of that, there are big political consequences of that, there are big economic consequences of that. At a political level, what we're seeing at the foundation is the breakdown of the old politics of left and right, what's degenerated into a politics of stone throwing, really, which is increasingly irrelevant, and when people look at Washington, I think it's what they don't like, and the emergence of a new politics of the future, where increasingly you see liberals and Democrats, the old left and the old right, coming together to advance ideas that really amount simply to pragmatic change. What the central fact of the transition we're now going through is the recognition that big centralized bureaucracies just aren't a good way to get things done anymore. IBM, General Motors, the Soviet Union, they've all learned that. The federal government hasn't learned that. And increasingly it's clear that to the extent we want to accomplish great things, whether it be taking care of the poor and helping them find their way into jobs, or whether it be making our economy more successful, that the way to accomplish that is not through this giant centralized system of power that we've organized in Washington, it's through decentralization.
From a historical standpoint, you talk about this third wave, the information wave that the Tofflers refer to as well, but how significant is this time in American history?
We're at a time unlike anything since the Civil War. And hopefully, and I think almost surely with a very different outcome from the kind of outcome we had in the Civil War. But the last time we made a transition between the Tofflers' waves, if you will, and they talk about a first wave, which was an agricultural age, or age of farming. Mm-hmm. And America was essentially an agricultural society up through the 1850s. And one of the, not by any means minimizing the importance of slavery, but one of the things happening in the Civil War was a conflict between the industrializing North and the agrarian South. And that led to, obviously a tragedy in American history, but also to fundamental changes as the North ultimately won out and the industrialization of America proceeded. We're in a time, and where beyond that, the roles of citizenship, the roles of the government, arguably the notion of large government institutions arose out of the Army and the success of the federal North, the North in the Civil War. The transformation that's now underway is very similar, but in many ways goes in the opposite direction, because the essence of the third wave, the essence of the information age, is the decentralization of power. A lot of what's happened over the course of the past 60 years is that in order to accomplish great human accomplishments, whether it be NATO or Normandy or Apollo or IBM, you had to give up some of your individuality, some of your freedom, to participate in a mass organization, put on a uniform to invade Normandy, put on a business suit to work at IBM and be an organization man, quote unquote. What's happening now is the success of small, nimble, agile institutions where conformity is a lot less important and individuality is a lot more valued. And that's, people I think sometimes are scared of change and scared of what will come with a transformation like this. But if they look at the real impact of it, this is a much more human kind of civilization, I think, that we're creating.
How do you think Newt Gingrich views his role in all of this?
I think Newt sees his role as a leader and as a learner and as an educator. And without any kind of hubris or sense of self-importance associated with that. But this is someone who dedicated himself at a fairly early age to understanding history, to understanding the great forces at work in our society, who believes that he does have a fairly profound alternative view of how government could work and should work, and understands that the role of a political leader is first to lead and only secondarily or thirdly to manage or to legislate. Newt's role is, as he sees it, and I think as he's acted on it in the country, is to explain his sense, and which I think represents America's sense, of where the country might go, to lead a national dialogue, to lead a national debate, and to move the country forward and out of a period which for 30 years or so has not been very constructive.
I was at dinner with him once and came up with 2 ideas that he thought were insightful, and he gave me his tie. It's one of the rhinoceros ties. He gets along well with people. He listens more than any politician I've ever known. I've been asked to come in and brief politicians on a particular issue. And you sit there, and what happens is the politician talks to you for half an hour. And you thought, so what am I doing here? I thought I was asked to come and brief you on a particular project. And what the politician wanted to do was talk. I've walked with Newt Gingrich. Sometimes he gets up at 6 o'clock in the morning and goes for an hour-long walk and invites people to join him. At those walks, when there's no telephone, there's no scheduler coming in, there are no interruptions, you'll start off, and I always have my little 3x5 card of 7 things I want to share with Gingrich. And he's got his list, but it's in his mind, not on a piece of paper. And when I walk through sort of my list of thoughts and walk through with his, at the end of the hour, without having taken notes, he can tell you back, this is what I learned from you today. These are the things I think we might do. This is what I'm going to do today. This is what I think we should do tomorrow. Here's what I'd like your help on. So he not only listens, he hears, and he learns, and then acts. And he does this over and over and over again, so that while some politicians hate going out and pressing the flesh, and it's boring to have to deal with a lot of people, Newt Gingrich learned something. What is it? Will Rogers said, I've never met somebody I didn't like. Newt Gingrich has never met someone he didn't learn something from.
Because we have a leadership which manipulates the system for its own narrow gain. And again, the gentleman from Pennsylvania brought out the fact that this is bipartisan. That a Republican member of the other body got $61 million in pork barrel for his state.
$67 million.
$67 million in pork barrel for his state, in return for which a Democratic member of this body got $9 million for his district. Though once again, the old boy network worked, and the only people that paid were the American people. And I think that the time has come to make 1984 the year in which the buck stops here, in this body, not at the White House, and then we let the American people on Election Day in 1984 decide, do they want to raise taxes? Do they want to control spending? Do they want to dump it all on their grandchildren in an act of absolute immorality? I think that the gentleman from Pennsylvania is doing us all a great service in holding this opportunity for us to talk about the decisions we face. I'm looking forward to working with the gentleman from California, who I see is on the floor today, because he's been one of the leaders in talking honestly about the challenges to us if we're going to serve our grandchildren intelligently. And I appreciate very much this chance. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman for his remarks. And I think to further make the point that the gentleman has just emphasized, all we have to do is look at next week's legislative schedule. This is the last week, supposedly, of the session of Congress. And there are literally dozens upon dozens of bills on here that we are going to run through this House next week. There are 28 that day. That's one day now. We're going to go through 28 bills. And another day, we're going to go through about another 22 bills. And, of course, we're all going to give those the appropriate consideration. And everybody is going to know just every detail of those bills. And we're going to know just how much money is down in each of those. Every member of this House is going to be fully informed as we go down through bill after bill after bill early next week. And we do this at the end of session 2. And then only as the press writes a few weeks later do we find out just how much all those bills cost us. So once again, it's a matter of the kind of irresponsible nature of the legislative process that gets us into these spending patterns.
If I were a liberal Democrat and I was sitting at home and I was watching Gingrich go at it one more time or watching Bob Walker intervene again, you know, I'd say, what are those guys doing? Why are they allowed to, you know, why do they put up with it?
Why are you doing it?
Well, we are doing, I think, two very different things. Bob Walker, who I think does a superb job of serving, in a sense, as our middle linebacker, is the traffic cop in the middle of the daily behavior of the House. And he is making sure that the conservative side and the Republican side gets a fair shake under the rules. And what he does is a very tough, hard-nosed intervention that I've seen and other people have seen on some days make billions of dollars of difference. And I think it's a legitimate role, and it's a role that he does with remarkable skill. I'm really being a college professor. I like hour-long special orders because they're close to 55-minute lectures. And I'm trying to lay out, and we'll be trying in 1987 to lay out a whole new series of ideas, because I really believe, as Theodore White said in his memoirs, that ideas in the long run are the most powerful force in politics. And I think we're at a point in American history where the solutions we have are 2 or 3 magnitudes smaller than the problems we're faced with. And so I think we need, both on the right and the left, both in the Republican and Democratic parties, we need politicians who spend some time on ideas. And I always think it's funny, you know, people will run in and they'll say, you can't ever say anything in 30-second commercials. Fine. Then they'll run in and say, why do you talk for an hour? And my answer is, which do you want? I mean, if you want the politics of ideas, it takes time to lay out ideas so people can look at the coherent whole.
Any other members in the chamber who desire to vote? If there are no other members on this vote, if there are no other members, the gentleman will state his inquiry.
I would inquire of the parliamentarian in the chair. Once the speaker has said the vote is closed and all time has expired, and that is on the tape, we have it on the videotape. Once that has been done, how can it be reopened?
The chair will state that it always has been the disposition of the chair and of every occupant of which the present occupant is aware, to permit any member who is in the chamber to vote or to change his vote, so long as he desires to do so and is in the chamber. The chair had been advised that there were other members en route, and therefore the chair was holding open and still holds open if members wish to change their votes or other members wish to vote.
Mr. Speaker, parliamentary inquiry.
Gentleman will state his inquiry.
Is it my understanding?
Gentleman will state his inquiry.
Is it my understanding, I want to make sure that on our side of the aisle we heard the Speaker correctly, that the Speaker has offered to hold open the vote until those members who have not yet voted but who wish to vote are recorded or change their vote.
The chair will respond to the gentleman's inquiry. It is and has been the policy
I apologize, I don't have order and I can't quite hear the chair.
The chair will, the House be in order. The chair will respond to the gentleman's inquiry. It always has been, to this occupant of the chair's knowledge, the policy of the chair to honor the desire of any member in the chamber to vote or to change his votes. And if no other members desire to vote or to change their votes, all time has expired On this vote, the yeas are
Mr.
206.
Parliamentary inquiry.
Nays are 205.
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman will state his inquiry. If it is a parliamentary inquiry, the chair will entertain
Mr.
it.
Speaker, I do have a parliamentary inquiry, and I would say the Speaker did not answer the last one. We understand what you have stated is the policy of the chair. But as a parliamentary matter, after the chair has said all time has expired, which the chair did, can you then reopen the vote?
The chair will respond. On more than one occasion, the present occupant of the chair, and in the chair's observation, other occupants of the chair, have permitted members to vote so long as those members are in the chamber and obviously desiring to cast a vote. Well, and that's the policy of the chair.
Well, further parliamentary inquiry. Mr. Speaker.
The chair will ask if any member desires to
further
vote,
parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Speaker.
Or desires to change his votes.
Mr. Speaker.
And if not, all time has expired.
Mr. Speaker.
The yeas are 206. The nays are 205. The bill is passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider laid upon the table.
Procedure in the end matters. We talk about human rights in the Philippines. We talk about human rights in Nicaragua. The Republican Party sees itself in the House faced with the least ethical speaker in the 20th century, in a situation where a democratic machine increasingly grinds down all opposition, frightens members, and you end up with the pathetic example of Chapman coming down at the last second and switching his vote. And I think this is typical what you're going to see more and more of in terms of arm-twisting, bullying tactics, and we think the very fabric of the House as an institution is in danger. From Speaker Reed up through Speaker Cannon, speakers grew increasingly powerful. By Speaker Cannon's time, he was in effect a dictator. He had absolute power. He controlled the Rules Committee. He controlled every committee assignment. There was a rebellion against him in 1910. That rebellion created the modern House, which had seniority, it had protection of individuals' rights, it had a discharge petition, it had a number of devices to limit the Speaker. Starting with Tip O'Neill, and then I think accelerating with amazing speed under Jim Wright, we are reverting to the Reed-Cannon-style Speaker as dictator. This Speaker owns the Rules Committee. I mean, I don't think you can say with a straight face that he can't get anything he wants out of the Rules Committee. This Speaker controls the schedule. This Speaker proved the other night that he has at least a handful of members who he can influence at least as much as their district does. And I think a strong Speaker with an unbridled willingness to run over the minority and an unbridled willingness to reshape the rules as they have now for 2 weeks on quorums is capable, I think, of being a very dangerous, extraordinarily powerful figure.
In November 1994, the Republicans captured a majority of House seats. Minority Leader Robert Michael was retiring from the House, and so Newt Gingrich was presumed to become the next Speaker.
As a mom, what's it like to have your son become Speaker of the House?
Well, being that I never did it before, it's kind of hard to say. It's what he really wanted. And up to the last minute, I was thinking, but Nudie, what if you don't get it? But he did get it. I'm very proud of him.
Are you nervous for him?
Oh, definitely.
In what ways?
Well, with all the shooting going around the White House, and Nudie is not the type to sit back and be quiet. He's going to say what he thinks. And that kind of, I mean, I never thought about that before. But then I guess with all this shooting, it makes you realize your son could be walking down the pavement or into the White House. And that is nice. Can't imagine not having Nudie. Really can't.
With all due respect to Mr. Michael, nothing will be the same. I can't think of anything that will be the same. I mean, you could give me things, and I don't think there would be anything that would be the same. The way he deals with the press, the way he deals with his colleagues, the way he gives assignments. I don't think we've seen a speaker. We will have seen a speaker like Newt or a House Majority Leader or any of those senior offices, because you got to realize something. Newt is not first and foremost a legislator. He's not even first and foremost a congressman. He is first and foremost a political visionary, a futurist, and a historian. All those things rolled into one. As he would say, I became a congressman because that was a great place to learn things and make speeches where people would listen to me and have an impact. But he didn't become a congressman to be a congressman, and therefore he's not becoming speaker to preside as speaker. He is carrying the essential core of himself into an incredibly visible podium with a lot of opportunity and a lot of responsibility. But he's not there to be the speaker.
I mentioned 4 current works that I commend to you to get for you and your staff, and frankly, for your key supporters back home to take a look at, because we want the advice of every citizen willing to help us do this job. First, in order to understand the scale of change we're living through, let me suggest to you Alvin and Heidi Toffler's Creating a New Civilization, The Politics of the Third Wave. It just came out from the Progress and Freedom Foundation. Here in 100 pages is 25 years of work by the couple who wrote Future Shock and coined the phrase in 1970, who wrote The Third Wave in 1980, and who wrote War and Anti-War a little over a year ago. 3 books that encompass the scale of change we're living through. In this 100 pages, you'll begin to sense what the 21st century America, the 21st century government, and the 21st century Congress need to be.
Alvin Toffler, when did you first meet Newt Gingrich?
Oh, probably 1971 or 2, maybe 3. He was still a young professor, not yet an elected official at all, hadn't even run for Congress as far as I know. And I was giving a speech to the American Council on Higher Education in Chicago. He flew up from Georgia to hear the speech. He had read Future Shock and he was excited by it. And so we met then, and then really didn't meet again until about 1975, at which point Heidi and I, with some other folks, organized a 2-day conference on Capitol Hill devoted to what we called anticipatory democracy, that is, to trying to get Congress to think long range. And we looked around at the guest list, or the participant list, and noticed that they were all Democrats. And we said to ourselves, gee, there must be a Republican futurist somewhere. And lo and behold, it turned out to be Newt Gingrich. And so from that point on, we've had a continuing relationship with Newt and with Marianne, his wife.
Heidi Toffler, how do you define anticipatory democracy?
Well, in the 60s, if you remember, the students were asking for participatory democracy, feeling that they were excluded from the political process. But as we discussed at that meeting in '75, much of the legislation that is passed and is in effect or was voted on 5 years before, so that you can't have any input into changing that. You can, if you look ahead and try to anticipate the legislation that is coming along, and then you have the possibility of changing it. So without that future element, you're always dealing with either the present or the past, about which you can do very little. But the future is still open, and you can try to change it.
How do each of you define social thinkers?
That's the president of Italy who gave us the medal. Yes,
very simple, an endangered species.
We use that terrible word "intellectuals" in this country as an epithet. In Europe, if one is called an intellectual, it's something that is praiseworthy, and I think it's a sad commentary on America and how we don't value our scientists, our thinkers, and our creators.
On to you, Heidi Toffler, again. How do you define, or what elements make up a good social thinker? What does it take?
Imagination, fearlessness, the willingness to be wrong. Al?
And some knowledge, I would argue, some knowledge of history and what other social thinkers have thought through the ages. That is, nobody is inventing the world de novo. There are people who've been thinking about deep social issues for millennia. And while I'm not suggesting that to be a social thinker you have to be an academic or a pedant or a specialist, you should be at least aware of the main views, main theories of social change, the main concepts in social thinking and in sociology, economics, political science.
I'd like to add one more thing, and I think that is you have to think globally. I think one can't be a social thinker today. It couldn't have been for the last 40 years without understanding the profound changes that the whole globe has undergone, politically, economically, and socially, and environmentally.
So
I'd like to throw another thought in there,
Sure.
and it has to do with Newt Gingrich. One of the words that he uses is a word that we similarly use, and that is a word that somehow sounds kind of almost hokey in American discourse. We use the term civilization. We say that what we're witnessing is the emergence not of a new technology or a new lifestyle, but of, in fact, a new civilization. It sounds inflated, pompous. Newt also uses the word civilization. But we're using these words in a very, in a non-accidental sense. I mean, the word is chosen for very definite reasons. We're not talking about small social changes. We're talking about, in our work, social changes that are of a historic character, that go beyond the last 300 years of industrial development and industrialization, the second wave, what we call the second wave of change that came with the Industrial Revolution. We're talking about changes today that affect not merely the technology, but family structure, values, urban systems, law, art, religion, and epistemology, all across the board and all interrelated. That change on that scale is, in fact, civilizational scale. And yet, you seldom hear that word in American social thought. You seldom hear that word in politics, with the exception, I would say, of Newt, because he thinks big. Whether you agree with him or not, and we have many differences with him, just for the record, you should know that we are secular, we're against prayer in the schools, we're pro-choice. We have many, many differences with Newt that we argue about, fight about, and laugh about. But there are certain things that we share, and that is thinking on a big scale in a society which pays off for super specialization. It pays off for minute criticism, for looking at things very, very closely and intensely, but frequently, in our judgment, forgetting the larger picture. It is a society that pays for examining the trees and ignoring the forest. Our job, as we see it, is to look at the forest. And as I say, I think Newt does. Newt thinks big, and there are people who make fun of that and think that there's something odd or...
Most politicians are punished for thinking big and thinking about the future. Politics is about today, and generally speaking, politicians don't have time to think. They have huge staffs who read and draft and... Pardon me? And digest. And that leaves you look at the health care reform bill, was it 11,500 pages? Now, no one could read that. The staffs probably couldn't get through it. So if you don't have time to read and you don't have time to have new experiences, what can you possibly think about except what you're doing on a day-to-day basis?
Alvin Toffler, you talked about intellectual disagreement. When he disagrees with you, how does Newt Gingrich respond?
We argue. Heidi had a big argument with him about prayer in the schools just recently, and then
wrote me a 4-page handwritten letter
in response.
And I sent him a book.
So we do this all the time, and sometimes just with jokes and laughter.
Yeah, we're arguing basically constitutional issues, and we both read history avidly, and I'm arguing separation of church and state with him. And he writes this longhand letter and writes fact and gives me what I would not call a fact, but an argument of his that substantiates prayer in the schools. And I sent him a copy of Brennan and Rehnquist by Irons, and we are working on the book. I Xeroxed a chapter and gave it to him at the governor's conference. And about a week later, I got this handwritten 4-page letter.
Do you think Newt Gingrich would like to be president?
I think anybody in politics who doesn't at least occasionally fantasize about that is lacking in imagination. I can't say that Newt has ever said to us, I want to be President of the United States. Indeed, he's probably more often said what he says to everybody, I want to be Speaker of the House.
And from the day we met him, he said, over 20 years ago, that was his goal in life.
Nevertheless.
And I think now that he's made his goal, this is the culmination of everything he wanted.
Yeah, well, I think differently. I think there's another goal beyond that, whether he knows it or not.
And what is that?
Well, I think anybody in his position has to be thinking about the presidency. And he, as I say, Newt would not say that. He probably may not even think that consciously at the moment, but surely he's too smart and too deep not to, at least, and too imaginative, at least not to ask himself in the middle of the night, couldn't I do better than whoever it is who's doing it?
In one of your more recent books called Power Shift, you talk about diversity in an organization. You refer to the term flex firm. How is that going to affect the way Newt Gingrich sets up the new Congress?
Well, I think what you've had in the Congress, if we look at it organizationally, the Congress is a very odd institution. First of all, it has its roots in the agrarian age, or what we would regard as it being a product of the first wave of the agrarian civilizations of the past, because there were parliaments and congresses going way, way back into ancient history. But then within the Congress, there have developed the committee structure, each one with a very narrow or a wide or narrow tunnel through which its ideas and discussion and legislation pass. And these, it's like a university in a sense, that there are distinct disciplines, and the disciplines don't necessarily talk to each other very well or very often. What then developed, and this is really interesting, is a whole set of semi-formal organizations and caucuses and groups, some of them quasi-officially attached, some of them unofficially attached, which bring together members of the Congress by interest or by region or by the Women's Caucus or the Black Caucus or the New England Caucus or the Farm Caucus. What these do are cross-cut the disciplinary divisions within the Congress in a kind of creating what organization theorists might call a matrix of a kind. I think that Newt wants to open up the Congress. He wants, after Republicans have been sort of squeezed out of participation by the Democratic majority, to the point at which they sometimes never got a chance to put amendments in, never got a chance to voice their objections on occasion. Newt wants to make that flexible and open. He's talked about some of the ideas that we've had in our book, The Third Wave, about public participation. There's no reason, for example, why a congressional hearing has to be this sort of dead ritual that takes place on the Hill with the members of Congress sitting in front of you and witnesses brought in from all over the country to sit and drone through their papers.
But I must say, I'm an addict of C-SPAN 1 and 2. I couldn't live without attending those hearings that your cameras make possible for me.
There's no reason, however, why, first, at a minimum, witnesses could not be called from all over the country who don't have to literally be sitting in that room. But in addition, there are all kinds of ideas that are outside the normal frame, outside even our constitutional frame, that I think we should be thinking about. Why is it impossible, for example, to have a congressional committee which consists of members of Congress, but also some non-members of Congress? There are all kinds of ways in which knowledge is floating through our society. Relevant information is out there and can be tapped in new ways. And Newt's talking about putting all the internal stuff within Congress online, make it immediately available, not just to the minority party, which in this case is the Democrats, but to the public.
On the net.
Put it on the net.
On the internet.
Heidi Toffler, do you think that if we were to sit here a year from now, we would be talking about significant changes in the way this Congress works?
Absolutely. I think that the first 100 days when Newt is going to try to give the contract, the legislative backing that he promised. And I think after that, that there are going to be so many possibilities for the kind of participation that not only the the minority party has been excluded from, but that the American people have been excluded from. I think you're going to see changes that are going to enliven this country and I think take some of the cynicism and pessimism that most Americans have toward our political process.
This is for both of you. Alvin Toffler, we'll start with you. For people who have not met Newt Gingrich, how do you describe him to others? How does his mind work?
Okay, that's a really good and important question. We jokingly among ourselves say there are two Newts. One is the Newt that people see in the soundbite on CNN or on CBS or the regular news programs, in which he gets to speak for 30 seconds and sometimes says something very colorful, sometimes says things that he should not say, sometimes says things that a day later he says, geez, I was mistaken, I really shouldn't have said it that way. And then there's the Newt who you see on C-SPAN, when he has an opportunity to develop his ideas for a half an hour or an hour. And you begin to see that his approaches to problems are not unconnected or random, nor are they just purely conventional Republican conservatism. This guy is indeed a revolutionary, not in the sense of a bomb-throwing character, but in a guy who thinks outside conventional thought. And if you look at what he talks about in private, what he reads science fiction, he writes some science fiction, he thinks deeply, he has read philosophy and history.
And a lot of the time he thinks out loud.
Yeah,
and that's when he puts his foot into it.
Moreover, there are two distinct differences between the way he thinks and the way most people think. One is, he is the only politician that we have met, and I was a journalist in Washington covering the White House and the Hill for years. We lived in Washington. We've been in touch with Washington all our lives practically. I have yet to meet another politician who will unself-consciously, without even embarrassment or awareness, say, you know, where should America be 30 or 40 years from now?
Or in the 21st century.
Most people, most politicians of both parties are thinking about the next election. He is thinking about the next election, but he's also thinking about 30 or 40 years out. That makes him different. The other thing about him is that he thinks on multiple levels at the same time. At the same time that he's thinking kind of strategically, what should our vision be of the 21st century, he's simultaneously thinking and outlining in his mind and sometimes in our office on a piece of paper, what should the strategy be for achieving that? What should the necessary projects be to achieve that? What should the tactics be? What should the projects be? He thinks on multiple levels simultaneously.
And if I can interrupt, he is learning all the time. He came out with Marianne, and they spent the first vacation in 10 years with us in our guest bedroom, and we went out New Year's Eve. We went out with another couple and their daughter and her date. Her date happened to be a district attorney from one of the counties in Los Angeles. And as soon as Newt found that out, he started questioning this young man, and asked him what kind of cases, how much evidence do they need. The young man started to talk. Newt whipped out his notebook and for 25 minutes took notes on everything that this young district attorney said. And I know that all went into a data bank in Newt's head someplace and got connected with all kinds of other things. Now, this is not the Newt Gingrich that you see in the sound bites, but this is the Newt Gingrich that I know and love, and the Marianne that I know and love, because the four of us and our daughter will sit around and just speculate about things, argue, debate, laugh. Our daughter jokingly calls Newt Uncle Newt and Marianne Aunt Marianne, and she's done that for years. They used to stay with us in New York. Hotel rooms were expensive, and we always enjoyed, being a substitute hotel, just to have the chance to have more time with Newt and interact, and we learn from each other.
The thing that people don't understand is that he is a stimulating intellectual. He's a stimulating mind. Now, again, when he gets into the arena, he can be really tough, combative, frequently nasty. But there is a lot more to this man than the public is seeing or than the camera reveals. And the same thing's true for Marianne. And I should say, to tell you where we're coming from politically, we're not Republicans.
And we're not Democrats.
And we're not Democrats. What we would like to see is a kind of realignment in both parties. We would like to see people in both parties start thinking 10, 20, 30 years ahead. And in fact, we have, since the election, we have indeed been approached by some of the Democratic leadership, and we are happy, delighted to participate with them in getting this process started.
We would like them to understand that there is a profound civilizational change occurring in our lifetimes, and that now information is the key factor of production, not land, labor, and capital.
Yeah, this is, let me say, I have sitting next to my bed a 1994 textbook for graduate students of economics. And in that book, it says the factors of production are land, labor, and capital. The word knowledge doesn't even appear in it. This is atrocious. This is ridiculous. Our economy is now an increasingly a third wave economy. If the first wave of change brought an agrarian revolution, and the second wave of change brought an industrial revolution to the world, we're now going through a third wave of change, which creates a totally new kind of economy in which knowledge is not just one of the factors of production. It's the central factor of production, because if you have the right knowledge in the right head at the right time, it can be a substitute. It can reduce the amount of energy you need, the amount of land, the amount of labor, the amount of capital, the amount of time. All the inputs to production can be reduced by the application of appropriate knowledge. This is something that our economists have not yet cottoned on to. They don't know how to measure it. They don't know how to deal with it. And it is unlike the other resources of production or sources of production, it's essentially infinite. It's not a scarce resource. Now,
this is something that Newt Gingrich understands.
Newt understands this.
He understands our books.
Incoming House Speaker Newt Gingrich has suggested this reading list for new members of Congress.
You come out here, see, in the middle of all these things we talk about in Congress, and you hang out for a while with rhinos, and you watch them get happy with a couple of apples and some carrots. This gives you a whole different perspective on life.
C-SPAN's profile of incoming House Speaker Newt Gingrich will continue in a few minutes. We'll have an hour-long interview with the Georgia congressman taped at Zoo Atlanta.
Later on C-SPAN, Hillary Rodham Clinton on the role of the First Lady. That's at 1:55 a.m. Eastern Time on C-SPAN.
Tuesday, January 3rd, live from New York City, a simulcast of Imus in the Morning. Our cameras will be in the studios of WFAN Radio, where you'll see what happens behind the scenes as Don Imus hosts his nationally syndicated talk show. Imus in the Morning, a live radio simulcast Tuesday, January 3rd on C-SPAN, beginning at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. C-SPAN, a public service created by America's cable television companies.
Now here's the C-SPAN program lineup for tomorrow morning. At 10:30 a.m. Eastern, we plan live coverage of a Senate Republican transition briefing. At noon, a group of lawmakers will discuss the Congressional Accountability Act. That's a bill which would require members of Congress to abide by the laws they set for others. And at 1:30 p.m., live coverage of a briefing by Senator Thomas Daschle of South Dakota, the incoming Democratic leader. And that's the C-SPAN program schedule for Tuesday. Now we continue with our profile of incoming House Speaker Newt Gingrich with an interview at Zoo Atlanta.
When do you think you'll know that you're really making a difference in fact instead of in words?
Oh, don't know that we'll know in our lifetime. I mean, I think a country this big and a people who are this free, you know, in some ways I think I'm probably making a difference a little bit every day, and we're having a different debate than we would have been having if we hadn't won. But, you know, I think we set a very high standard. The weekend we can wake up on a Monday and no child has been killed, and everybody's going to a school that their parents think is successful, and everybody can go out and create jobs and have a chance to compete in the world market, then we'll have won. And I don't know that we'll get there in my lifetime, but I know that what we have to do literally is get up each morning and work as hard as we can for that day, and then make the next set of decisions the same way. I don't think you can project ahead, you know, 6 months or a year or 5 years. Not at this level. At this level, you just got to try to get through one day at a time. You can have general directions, general plans, but you can't worry over 6 months or a year or 5 years. You've got to focus. Can I make an impact today? And of course, you know, as Speaker of the House, you have some impact every day. I think that's already the fact that we hired the first 2 women to be officers of the House in the history of the institution. The fact that we hired the first Asian American, the fact that we brought in a professional from the Secret Service with 32 years experience to be Sergeant at Arms. Each of these is real impact already. And then the Boys Town debate is, whether you're for it or against it, it's a debate about how do we replace the welfare system and how do we start changing things. So all these things matter.
Yesterday I was at the Johnson Library in Austin, and I was standing looking at a wall, and up on the wall, I wrote it down, 1,000 laws of the Great Society. And they had all the pins up there, and then underneath they listed the different categories: civil rights, education, war on poverty, Medicare, National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, Job Corps, Head Start. And as I was standing there watching, I was just thinking about what you've been saying about the need for change. And one of those things is National Endowment for the Arts and the Humanities, and public television and things like that. You're saying what about places like that?
Well, I'm saying that Lyndon Johnson tried to do a lot of things, and in many ways I think he saw himself as the final embodiment of the New Deal effort to change America. But that a lot of the things he tried didn't work, that the war on poverty increased poverty, that the National Endowments for the Arts has become a plaything of it's art patronage for an elite group, and it is funding for avant-garde people who are explicitly not accepted by most of the taxpayers who were coerced into paying for it. The National Endowment for Humanities, as Lynn Cheney now admits, has gone off the deep end on proposing changes that are destructive of American civilization. And so, you know, sometimes you got to stop and take and assess things. But the best example is the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Whatever argument there was in the age of broadcast television for the taxpayer to be forced to finance a television network for a handful of elite people, and that's what